Women were disappearing across San Diego. Some were found in alleyways and ravines, others in dumpsters just blocks from where they'd last been seen alive. And some, like 19-year-old Mary Colette Rawlinson, simply vanished, leaving behind apartments, clothing, friends, and unfinished lives. As the body count mounted, investigators began asking a terrifying question. Was one man hunting women across the city? Or were these women dying because too many people believed no one would notice? This is their story.
Hi, I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Amy.
And you're listening to She Goes by Jane. At the end of this episode and every episode, we will be joined by a special guest who will read an original poem by Amy Baker about the women we're featuring. This week, we are joined by Lana Turner.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Amy.
Vanessa, we are in the middle of a 3-part series on women who went missing in San Diego. And I just wanted to check in with what your thoughts were so far.
Well, I mean, I'm not exactly sure where we're going with this.
Mm-hmm.
Last week, it just started with, it seems like a lot of women are affected. And so I'm not sure exactly, I don't know what to expect. Is it one person that's doing all of this? Is it just a coincidence that all these women is it all different people that are doing these things to them? I guess I don't fully understand what's happening yet.
So you're exactly where I think a lot of investigators were at this time, where the public was at this time, questioning what is it exactly we're looking at here?
What and why, right?
Right. So last week we covered the case of 2 women and hinted at a broader issue of what was happening to sex workers in the 1980s in San Diego. And this week we're going to dig in a little bit more. And I'm not sure necessarily everything's going to be illuminated, but this week we're going to get into more of what the atmosphere was at the time. So it's a lot. We're going to talk about a lot of names today.
Okay. So by the time we're done this 3-part, is next week's going to be a ton of names as well?
Next week is going to also be a lot of names. Yes.
Okay.
So the sort of full scope of what we're looking at really takes all 3 episodes to really understand, but they're also self-contained. So Okay. So we're going to start talking more in depth about some of the cases in this episode and then branch out into more next episode to talk really about what was happening to women in San Diego.
Okay.
At just 19 years old, Mary Colette Rawlinson went by many names. Colette Rawlinson, Rita Elizabeth Price, Elizabeth Rita Rawlinson. It was a shifting identity, like trying on new clothes to see how they fit. Looking at photos of the very striking teenager with her light brown hair and hazel eyes, she looks incredibly young. And it's really hard to picture her out on San Diego's streets, where she worked as one of the hundreds of the city's sex workers. But Colette worked on the streets and the motel rooms along El Cajon Boulevard. On October 30th, 1985, Colette let herself out of the home she shared with a male companion. "I'll be right back," she said, and closed the door behind her. But she never was. So, just to situate us. In the last episode, we told the story of 2 women, Donna Gentili, who sat in a jail cell and recorded a message that if anything happened to her, it would not be by her hand. And Cynthia Main, a young mother who her sister says saw the best in everyone, even those who might not have deserved it. Those 2 women knew each other. They were friends, some said, and they moved through the same streets, both finding work as sex workers. And in different ways, both had been pulled into working with law enforcement. They were asked to inform and to cooperate with police. Both were navigating a system that promised protection, but often delivered something far less certain in return. Both would disappear from San Diego's streets. Donna was found murdered shortly after she disappeared. Cynthia's disappearance seemed different. Her car was left behind in a restaurant parking lot with her belongings still inside. There were no clear signs of a struggle. No indication of where she might have gone. For a long time, their stories were treated as separate, isolated acts of violence against one of the city's most marginalized populations. But they weren't the only ones. Across San Diego, throughout the mid-1980s, women, many of whom were living and working along the same stretch of El Cajon Boulevard, were disappearing. And while the women knew from the start that something was happening, it took far longer for the law enforcement officers who knew them, worked with them, and often exploited them to acknowledge the same. But as the numbers of the cases grew, so did the urgency to explain the disappearances, because what was happening was beginning to seem a lot less like isolated incidents and more like a pattern. And the growing question really was whether that pattern pointed to one person or something much larger.
So really, when it was just a few here and there, nobody looked into it as much. So it started to grow, and then that's when it became a problem.
Yeah, the women who worked along the streets were noticing things, but that was not trickling up to law enforcement at all.
Okay.
Despite the fact that they worked very closely with law enforcement, right? The Vice Squad was out on El Cajon regularly.
Yeah, because a lot of the time those women were being coerced into helping the police as, like, I don't know, like kind of informants or...
Yeah. So what we said in the last episode was that sex work, the city was really unhappy with sex work happening. But at the same time, it's also a low-level crime. And so basically, sex workers were told, like, hey, if you become one of our informers, if you help us, we'll help you by helping you out with this prostitution charge that we were just going to lodge against you, right?
Right. But then when that person goes missing, you think that would become like a giant red flag in itself. But it didn't seem to be.
No, these women and the officers knew each other. So the fact that there was this disconnect is indicative of how I think people were viewing the women who were sex workers.
Right. And it's especially bad because in the last episode, you were telling us about how there was even almost a romance going on between one of the officers and one of the women. So just why are we not looking? Why are we not? Yeah. Or I guess we're looking now. Now we're listening, right?
Not quite yet.
Oh, we're not yet?
No,
okay.
We're not there yet.
Not there yet.
Because in the 1980s, El Cajon Boulevard had become one of the centers for sex work in San Diego. During the day, it was mothers and children were gathering their kids to bus stops to get them to school, and businesses had opened their doors, just like any other kind of city neighborhood. But at night, it was altogether different. So under the block's neon lights, customers would pull up, lining the streets with their vehicles, and women would often do their work in those same cars. Or they'd head to someplace less conspicuous, like an alleyway or one of the area's many hourly motels. But then the lines between kind of a traditional neighborhood and a red light district were becoming increasingly blurry. There were reports of teenage girls being propositioned during the day by men who had assumed they were also sex workers.
So they were not sex workers. They were just teenagers out living their lives and men are approaching them?
Yeah. Which, I mean, I think is also one of the things that we're going to get into more is a lot of the sex workers were also teenagers, right?
Right.
And so, you have this tension that starts happening in this neighborhood, and the city starts pressuring the police to curtail the presence of sex workers on El Cajon. By 1987, the police chief starts touting the Vice Squad's successes in arresting women who worked that strip, stating that they'd increased arrests for prostitution by 53% that year. And though he did acknowledge, despite this, it's the same old story. The jail revolving door continues. Prostitutes are arrested and back on the streets within the hour. But while the police chief and the city officials had turned their sights to the criminalization and monitoring of sex work, the women who worked down on the boulevard were concerned with something else entirely. In 1987, Los Angeles Times reporter Richard Serrano spent time with these women to understand what their experiences were like on El Cajon. One night, he sat in room 34 of an El Cajon motel talking to a woman named Patty. Patty had been a sex worker since she was 15. Now, as an adult, she was addicted to heroin, and she was using the money from her clients to buy her next fix. Patty was scared. She told Serrano about the dangers she faced getting into cars with strangers. During their conversation, Vicky, another sex worker, overheard what they were saying. They'd been talking about sex workers who'd been found dead in San Diego County, and their bodies dropped in alleyway dumpsters or along remote roadsides. Vicky, Serrano wrote, burst into tears and shook her head. "Sarah's dead," she said. "Sarah's dead."
What do we know about Sarah?
Sarah is actually one of the women who we're going to talk about in this episode and next episode. But Vicky likely met this woman named Sarah, who goes by two names, Sarah Finland Gedalicia, also known as Sarah Fineland Thornton. She was a 36-year-old who was unhoused and addicted to drugs. Like Vicky and Patty, she'd worked as a sex worker until one day she just disappeared. No one could pinpoint exactly when they had last seen her, but she'd stopped showing up and no one knew where she was. But on September 25th, 1987, just before this interview was conducted, a migrant worker had found her nude body along Arnold Way, a rural road in Alpine. Her fingerprints and no regrets tattoo on her right shoulder are what helped identify her. Sarah had been strangled to death and had been left along this roadway about a week before she was found. Now, to the police, she was just another number. But as you can see, to the women of El Cajon, she was a friend, she was a colleague, she was someone whose face they recognized and whose name they knew. The women, they had always known that there were risks in the work that they did. Everyone, it seemed, had a story of a man who was too aggressive, or a time they'd got into a car and worried that they wouldn't make it back to El Cajon. But in the 1980s, their fears were escalating. Women disappeared one by one. Sometimes their bodies would be found days later. Sometimes that was just around the corner in a dark alley. Sometimes that was miles away. And the women left behind had begun to speculate there could be a serial killer targeting sex workers. Now, they start to be much more cautious. They're asking men more questions before they get into their cars. They're carrying weapons on them. They knew these measures were likely in vain, but it was just some small way they could protect themselves because San Diego law enforcement certainly wasn't. To Sheriff John Duffy, who headed the San Diego Sheriff's Department, the pressure to look into these murders was overblown. Most of the missing and murdered women had disappeared in the city, but their bodies were often left outside the city limits, placing the investigation with the Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Duffy had a long list of concerns, and dead sex workers were nowhere near the top. He'd headed up the department since 1971, and by the 1980s, his top concerns were overcrowding in the jail and reducing drug trafficking. On July 7, 1987, he wrote to the Daily Times Advocate to express his views on the growing concern that was gaining traction actually outside the sex worker community. There is not a disproportionate number of female dead bodies being found in the county, he assured the public. Any speculation about a serial killer preying on prostitutes is just that, speculation.
I don't know what a disproportionate number would be, because isn't any murder not okay? Do we need a disproportionate number for it to be not okay?
Right.
I don't really understand what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in his mind, it can't be a serial killer because they're just not finding more murder victims than usual.
How many are they finding? It seems like a lot.
Yeah, to me.
Is it significant? It's a significant number that we're talking here, right?
So we're going to get into just how many women had gone missing by the time he makes this statement. And so we're going to see exactly what kind of and what level.
Okay, so these are the ones just leading up to that statement, not ones after.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it is overwhelming. I don't know how he came to a place where he just felt like he could say this.
Okay.
Now, behind the scenes, though, it's clear that the San Diego Sheriff's Department and also the city, they're all beginning to speculate. Quietly, they'd begun to investigate some of the deaths of the young women, and many of these women had been sex workers, some of them had been addicted to drugs, and all of them had been dumped throughout the county. It was an escalating crisis that they just weren't ready to admit publicly yet. So we're going to go behind the scenes. What exactly are we ignoring here? Mm-hmm. Now, one of the first to go missing was a woman we talked about in our first episode, Donna Gentili. Donna was an informant for the San Diego Police's Internal Affairs Department and had been jailed on a prostitution charge. And she was let out early to offer her statements against multiple officers within the Vice Department, an act that she worried put her life in jeopardy. Within 2 weeks of making her statement, Donna was dead, and her body was found hidden in a ravine outside the city limits with dirt and gravel shoved in her mouth and down her throat. In August, a little over a month later, 18-year-old Tara Simpson's body was found in a dumpster behind an El Cajon Boulevard business by a man collecting aluminum cans. Tara had started doing sex work in Oregon when she was 16, and by the time she was 18, had moved to San Diego. And that year, her baby died, and she indicated to her husband that she was feeling suicidal. Despite the fact that Tara was found beaten with her teeth knocked out and her body set on fire, her death was ruled an accidental overdose from cocaine and alcohol.
How would an accidental overdose explain that she was beaten and her teeth knocked out and her body set on fire?
Exactly.
How does that? I don't understand.
Yeah. So this is the coroner's determination that she died by accidental overdose.
I don't doubt that she died of overdose, but was she given?
There's some logical problems here. Obviously, yes. Someone can die of an accidental overdose and then someone can panic and try to hide their body.
They wouldn't beat them at that point.
Right. When did that happen?
Yeah.
When was she attacked? Yeah.
And if it was an accident and she was by herself, the body would not be on fire. Yeah. So there's some logic flaws happening.
Now, September 31st, 31-year-old Patricia Smith's body is found in an El Cajon area motel room, and she had been beaten and stabbed to death. Just weeks later, a man called the sheriff's department to report a body. It was 25-year-old Marcia Funderbank, who was laying on her side on the ground near Old Highway 80 in Pine Valley. The mother of two still wore her t-shirt that read, "Last Chance In," and had a scarf tied around her face and neck. Like Donna, dirt and gravel had been shoved into her mouth and throat.
There's a lot of commonalities between these, right? The beatings and then the dirt.
Yeah,
so it would indicate either the same person or the same person did those two anyway. I really still don't know what to think here.
Now, that October, 20-year-old Juna Thomas's body was found on Guyman Street on a sidewalk by a jogger, and she had been strangled to death. And then just weeks later, 19-year-old Colette Rawlinson said, "I'll be right back," to the man she lived with and never came home. Even then, even with this first wave of murders and disappearances, the women of El Cajon knew something was wrong.
So this first wave, is this what prompted the "it's not a disproportionate number of women" statement?
Oh, no, that we're still another year out from that statement.
Okay.
Year and a half.
So there's going to be more added.
Yes.
And he's still dismissing it.
It didn't stop there. Now,
okay.
Thankfully, there were some people who were concerned. Enter Thomas Street. He's a detective with the Homicide Division at San Diego's Sheriff Department. Street was something of an outlier when it came to the rest of the force. By 1983, he actually had a doctorate in human behavior, which is a degree he found really useful in his work in the force. Street had handled Donna Gentile's case, and it was clear to him that she was murdered, but he couldn't pinpoint who had committed the crime. He'd wondered at the crime scene because it had shown that someone had put a level of thought into where they left Donna, which was in a remote area in a ravine where she would be hard to find. This was unusual to him because he found that in most murders involving sex workers, their bodies would be unceremoniously dumped alongside roads, which is a way to indicate that the killer was maybe primed to believe that it wasn't necessary to hide their bodies, as though the killers knew or supposed maybe that their murders mattered very little. So why would Donna be any different? Added to that, the scene had been carefully cleaned and any evidence or tire tracks or footprints had been wiped away. So could the person responsible for her murder have been aware enough of how those pieces of evidence might be used in an investigation? These were all questions that he was pondering, which were deviations from normal behaviors he'd seen before in murders like these. But then something else happened. A city officer approached him and said that Street's investigation into Donna's murder would, quote, be the end of his career. Now, without these tension points, it's not clear how closely Street would have looked into these murders, but as body after body was found in remote areas around the county, he began to work on some theories. And one of those theories is that it's possible that one person could be targeting the women of San Diego. Now, while Thomas Street's mind is beginning to turn over these possibilities that sex workers, particularly those who worked along El Cajon, were being targeted, more women were going missing and found murdered. On Saturday, January 4th, 1986, 27-year-old Linda Nelson was found near an off-ramp of Interstate 805 and 47th Street. Linda was a sex worker, but the mother of two was last seen the night before at a party at a friend's house, and they thought she had left sometime between 9 and 11 p.m. Just before 7 a.m. the next morning, 2 women who were returning home from work found her body, and she had been beaten and strangled. Later that month, 30-year-old Linda Freeby's husband reported her missing. He said he had dropped her off at Broadway and Palomar in Chula Vista so she could do some shopping. Her body was found the next day behind an office building on Mania Street. She'd been strangled with a wire and stabbed several times.
Was she a sex worker?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are all of them?
Not all of the women we're going to talk about were. There are some liars to the pattern.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, because if somebody was specifically targeting sex workers, but then you said that they're already approaching teenage girls in the daytime thinking they're sex workers, how many other women were mistaken?
Who could be just picked up in this, right?
Okay.
Now, on February 5th, a clerk arriving for work at the Glidden Paint Company in North Park found 24-year-old Deborah Stanford's body left propped against a van's rear tire in the employee parking lot. Like the other women, Deborah was a sex worker. When she was found, she was naked, but her fingers and toenails were still painted the same iridescent purple she'd last been seen with, and she still had on her blue fan earrings. Based on the thin line visible on her throat, she had been strangled with a wire. Then, just days after that, on February 11th, 22-year-old Trina Carpenter's body was found inside a dumpster. Just days shy of her 23rd birthday, Trina, who also went by Nina Simmons, had been strangled and placed inside a green canvas bag before the dumpster was set on fire. And then Cynthia Main disappeared. Cynthia, who was the focus of our first episode in this series, was the daughter of a police officer. By the time she was an adult, she'd become addicted to drugs and had started selling sticks on El Cajon. And like Donna Gentili, she'd also served as a police informant and had started what seemed to be a romantic relationship with someone on the Vice Squad. On February 21st, Cynthia said goodbye to her mother and left to see a movie, but she never came home. Her car was found abandoned in a parking lot not far away in La Mesa, but Cynthia was never seen again. We'll be back in a moment.
So considering that Cynthia's the daughter of a police officer, did that cause more concern?
Yeah, so Cynthia's history with police officers, she's grown up with police officers. By the time that she is at this place in her life, her father was actually a disgraced police officer because he'd gotten in trouble for some financial mishand. And he had also passed away. So I think largely her connection to police had kind of deteriorated over time. So, which I think might be different if her father had been alive and really still active with the force, that he could be asking more difficult questions.
Right, because typically when we've covered other cases that involve the child of a police officer, that's the turning point usually when people start taking note of what's happening.
I think by this point, her identity had been logged in the city PD's mind as she's a sex worker. She's, always in trouble. She's addicted to drugs.
Isn't it funny how that kind of just erases the fact that she was ever somebody's daughter?
Exactly. Who she was as a person beyond those factors starts getting clouded. To them, she's just one of the many sex workers that they deal with, right? Now, in the first few months of 1986, very few weeks were passing without another woman going missing or being found murdered in the county. By the time Trina Carpenter's body was found, speculation had left the streets and had made its way actually into the local papers. One headline in the Carmelo Star that February read, "Slain woman may be fifth victim of killer."
Fifth.
So I think they're only counting a few of the women who had similarities to Trina's death, which was specifically being placed in dumpsters. But it's the first time we start to see really these kind of questions being asked.
Okay. So I guess any level of doubt is going to be good, right? At that point, yeah.
Any questioning, right?
Yeah.
But police and other officials, they push back on this narrative. Lieutenant Phil Jarvis said, "It's individual crimes on individual people by individual suspects." And then he added, "Am I 100% positive? No, I won't be until I have suspects in hand."
If that many individual suspects are doing individual crimes to individual people, isn't that still a cause for public concern?
Yeah,
Isn't it? Don't we now have an epidemic of many individuals being violent
exactly.
instead of just one individual
Committing.
causing all of
Yeah.
this? Isn't that almost worse in a way, if not just as bad?
Right. And I think that's one of the things that we do as a public, too. We have a lot of fear of, say, a serial killer, right, who goes out and kills many people. But that does, yes, leave unaddressed. Like many people who feel that they can commit murder and are committing one murder.
Right. They're just as concerning,
Yeah.
if not worse in a way, because we like to think of the person committing these crimes as this anomaly. So if it's this common, then that means there are many more killers among us than we can even fathom.
Exactly.
Which is so disturbing.
It's not just one person who's moved to kill many people. It's many people who are moved to kill.
Yeah.
Now, coroner David Stark said, "We don't see any other pattern other than it involved manual strangulation."
What about the dirt?
2 women with dirt.
Yeah.
Now, that February, police made their first arrest, Donald Crouch, who was named as a suspect in the murder of Linda Freeby, the woman whose body had been found behind an office building. His live-in companion had reported him to the police after Crouch had returned home and claimed to have murdered, in his word, prostitute. And while this murder seemed isolated, police began looking at the possibility that the 28-year-old man could be connected to other murders.
So he went home and told his partner who he lived with that he did that?
So whoever he lived with, yes.
Huh.
Yeah. Now, even though they have him in custody, women were still dying. And not all of them were classified as murders, but it's kind of this relentless pattern of deaths that we keep seeing. In April of 1986, 19-year-old Michelle Riccio sat at her parents' kitchen table. Michelle, who was addicted to meth and worked as a sex worker, was explaining to her parents what life was like and the fears she had. As she slipped off her jewelry and handed it to her mother, she said, "You don't know what it's like out there, Mom. You have no idea." Her parents were worried about her because as a child, Michelle had been effervescent and artistic, leading impromptu plays with the neighborhood kids, playing the flute, painting murals on her sister's walls. But by high school, she dropped out and started using drugs, and her parents had tried to help her, and she'd been in and out of clinics, but with no success. Finally, they'd actually asked her to move out of their house as kind of a tough love approach, but that hadn't worked either. Just days after Michelle took off her jewelry and left their house, they'd returned home to a coroner's card stuck to their front door. It had a note asking them to call immediately. They did. "Your daughter has expired," the coroner told them in a monotone voice.
How would you even process that sentence?
With no emotion, no understanding.
Expired.
Yeah.
Huh.
Now, they couldn't process this either. They were trying to figure out what would happen. The coroner didn't give them information, really. So Michelle's father, Jerry, he would actually have to call the homicide investigators to actually ask what had happened to Michelle. Jerry was told that she had died of self-inflicted drug overdose and that her body had been found in an orange grove with a syringe and several needles nearby. And that was all the information that they were given. On May 9th, Joanne Sweets, who also went by Ebony Sweets, was found in a dumpster near El Cajon. Joanne, who was 34, had been a word processor at a stock brokerage company when she lived in New Jersey, and then she'd moved to California to start a new life. And she'd been missing for 3 days before police found her burned body inside a dumpster. She'd been beaten. She had a fractured spinal cord, broken clavicle, broken rib, and she died by strangulation. That June, Jodelle Jenkins' body was found in a ravine not far from where Michelle Riccio's body had been found. Jodelle, who was 28, was from San Diego and had been living at the Welcome Inn in Leucadia. A longtime addict, her father said that she tried to get clean. On June 30th, 2 horseback riders spotted her nude body in a ravine. Several of her teeth were missing, and a man's tie was knotted around her neck. The coroner ruled her death an accidental, self-administered overdose, like Michelle. On July 22nd, 1986, a sheriff's helicopter passing over Buckman Springs saw what looked like an abandoned car and called it in. The responding officer found the skeletal remains of a woman not far from the vehicle. It would take 4.5 years before she was identified as Carol Goshrowski, a 26-year-old mother of 2. Her husband had reported her missing on June 23rd, the day after she disappeared, and it appears this report was ignored. Days later, on July 31st, it was Teresa Brewer. Her mother hadn't seen her in a few weeks when she called to report her missing, and Teresa's body had been found on a piece of cardboard off I-8 with an extension cord wrapped around her waist and tied below her knees. She'd been strangled and her ribs were fractured. Teresa had been a nurse, but she turned to sex work after leaving her husband. They'd met when he was stationed in San Diego, and her husband would later say, "Times got hard for her. She needed money. She told me she was worried. She called me once and told me to get her out of San Diego, and I've always wondered who would hurt her. She was so sweet." On August 15th, 1986, 37-year-old Sophia Glover was found naked on an army blanket off Madison Avenue, and she'd been strangled to death.
There's just so many.
Yeah. So I'm presenting it like this because I want the full magnitude of what this man said, that there was not a disproportionate number of women being found dead. Yeah.
And then just as you're telling this little tiny piece of each one of their stories, there's always somebody who loves and cares about them. So that whole idea of, oh, it's a sex worker, nobody's looking for them, it's not true.
No. August 28th, Nancy White, 22 years old, left her home in the El Toro Marine Base, and she pulled over when her car was overheating, and she called her husband to let him know, where her car was found abandoned with her belongings still inside when someone made it there. 3 days later, her body was found in Carlsbad. She'd been beaten and strangled. Now, unlike the others, Nancy had not worked as a sex worker. October 1st, 1986, the remains of a woman were found on the Pala Indian Reservation, and her nipples and right ear had been sliced off. December 31st, 1986, another set of remains, this time skeletonized, were found on the Pala Indian Reservation. It would take until the new year to identify her as Melissa Jean White, a 22-year-old from Oceanside. January 3rd, 1987, Juliana Santiano's body was found in Silver Strand State Park. She had left her cousin's home in Long Beach, and a friend had told that cousin that Juliana had actually gone home to Baldwin Park. Her mother, meanwhile, thought she was still at her cousin's house, and so it would be months before anyone realized that she was missing. March 1987, Vola Wright, a 37-year-old, is found dead. Initially, her injuries appeared to be from being hit by a car. April 23rd, 1987, Rose Marie Ritter, who was actually a friend of Donna Gentili's and Cynthia Main, she was found dead by migrant farm workers, and the coroner determined there were large amounts of meth in her system. May 10th, 1987, Rhonda Hollis's body was found by 2 joggers in Bonita. She still wore the Foxy Lady necklace that she'd put on. Rhonda had been stabbed, strangled, and bound. Her little sister, just 14 years old, said, "She was into bad things, but she was a good person. She didn't want to hurt people. She was really caring." June 1987, Anna Varela, 32, was found strangled outside of Pine Valley.
Was Anna the last of them?
No. But that covers our timeline up to
that statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can go out on a limb and say he was wrong.
Yeah.
To even, he sounded foolish saying that, I think, at that point.
But now that you've heard.
Yeah. He was definitely foolish in saying it.
So.
And negligent.
By that August. So we're August 1987. It's becoming more than evident to everyone that women are being targeted. And the Daily Times Advocate reporter Catherine Spearneck reports on it in a piece titled "A Pattern of Death, Who's Killing the Women?" She interviewed Tom Street, the detective who had been wondering the same thing Catherine Spearneck had. Who was killing the women? By that summer, he was still working through his theories. "I don't think there's any one person running around killing all these women. I think there could be several," he told her. But then he did float the possibility that all but one of the 26 of the murders they had under consideration at that time could be related. Lieutenant Bill Baxter said, "Nobody has excluded the fact that we might have a series that we haven't discovered yet. but exists as a possibility more than a probability. And then he added, ultimately, the question exists. Is there a serial killer? For now, we have to leave it at that because we don't know. He said the question that they keep on asking is, why does it appear there are substantial numbers of women dying in ways we're just not sure of? Now, the position of both men seemed to be an about face from where both of their agencies had been just the months prior, insisting that there were no connections between any of these cases, right?
Do we know why that they had the change of heart at this point?
I mean, I think that there's the official statements by, those heading the city PD and the sheriff's department to say, like, no, there's nothing going on here. But the people actually more on the ground working the cases, kind of in close to it, are asking more difficult questions and are going against the grain, I think, in asking those and stating those things publicly.
Well, I can't imagine that a police officer that, say, has to keep answering to these calls is going to want to keep ignoring this. You wouldn't want to keep finding the same thing over and over and over again. So it's at some point you're going to get really worn out from this situation and need it to be taken care of.
We need to do something about this. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
Now, they're working through what is a growing amount of cases, and it's proving frustrating for both Street and Baxter. Baxter likens the whole thing to a puzzle, and he says they're basically starting with a puzzle piece, which is the crime and the body, and they're trying to find the next pieces without knowing how big the puzzle is. It's like operating without the picture on the box. Now, they started with commonalities. Now, many of the women had been involved in sex work, but not all of them, like Nancy White. She had been working in sales. Many of them were addicted to drugs. Some of them were strangled. A few were stabbed. Some were thrown in dumpsters. Others were left along highways. And some of the women had been rolled as drug overdoses, but they start to wonder about the story behind some of those determinations. Thank God someone has.
Right. Well, and then we went back to the part 2 where most are just placed somewhere in the open. It's so strange because you mentioned that they're on top of blankets and on top of cardboard. We're not even attempting to cover them.
No.
But then Donna, completely hidden.
Yeah.
So it's just, there's a lot to think through there, like you said, this puzzle.
So you can see them probably working through it like, okay, how many women had drugs in their system and trying to...
You're almost like sorting them into groups of like...
How many women were found in a dumpster? How many women were... And trying to figure out what is there a common thread between all of these? And so a pattern, it didn't seem to start emerging. So they're going down even to smaller, finer details. They're considering all the possibilities, like how many of these women were mothers? Is that a commonality? How many of them had tattoos? What's the race and ethnicity of each of the victims? Where were they? What were they wearing? Right?
So they're really actually thinking through it at this point.
Yeah, so because a clear pattern is not emerging for all of the women in this pool that they're considering. In establishing these patterns, though, they're actually coming up against inaccurate or incomplete information. So to be clear, Vanessa, you said earlier, these women had people who cared about them, which is absolutely true. But sometimes they were estranged from families and friends and communities, meaning that sometimes these were longer breaks or sometimes the women weren't in communication regularly. So kind of pinpointing details surrounding the disappearances and murders was difficult. Many didn't remember when they last saw the victims, let alone what they were wearing or who they were spending time with, kind of those really small details that can help a case evolve. But even with these difficulties and differences, the idea of a serial killer had actually entered the realm of possibilities. Like you can see the beginnings of this in what Street said and what Baxter said and what the newspapers are saying, that this is in the air at the time. They even contacted police in Washington and asked questions about the Green River Killer. They wanted to know his pattern, who he targeted, and if he'd gone dark during the time period women had started to go missing in San Diego. It's this kind of intriguing line of questioning, and one that officials in Washington were downplaying. They're like, no, you don't have our killer down there. But the thought was still lingering. Both men knew that they had to make progress on these cases, that, they would need more manpower. Bill Baxter made a request for 3 more detectives to be added to homicide detail, but Sheriff Duffy again made clear that this is not a priority. Duffy said homicides have dramatically increased in recent years, and most of the increase is directly related to drug trafficking and abuse, as well as the illegal alien problem.
Okay, so wait, is Duffy the same guy from the big weird statement earlier?
Yes.
Okay, so this is his personality.
Yeah, so he basically has ranked his concerns, and none of them have to deal with women who are working as sex workers being killed. Like,
the problem comes down to drug trafficking, abuse, and, of course, illegal aliens.
Yeah, so he's like, these are my priorities in the
but not
area. And so women being murdered is not in there. It's very clear to newspaper reporters at the time, to us sitting here years later, that something is wrong. But he looks at those lists of women and doesn't see anything. Now the public is starting to ask questions and they're wanting answers. Was there a serial killer stalking San Diego? And if there wasn't, then what exactly was happening in San Diego?
I'm glad people stopped listening to him at this point. I'm just like, no.
Like, we
disregard what is happening.
Still have questions.
So are we going to find out what was happening in San Diego?
In our next episode, yes, I think will be a clearer picture about what's going on. Because this question about what exactly is happening is a question that's ultimately going to divide San Diego law enforcement. It ends in radical changes that are going to shake up both the city PD and the sheriff's office. And by the end, several men, both in law enforcement and outside of law enforcement, are going to be arrested for a variety of crimes. Others are going to lose their jobs, and families are going to be left to find solace in each other and the community's response to their loved ones' murders.
We are now going to listen to Amy's poem, Neon Lights Elegy, read by Lana Turner. Lana is a comedian, filmmaker, writer, producer, co-director, and published comic book author whose work spans stand-up, television, film, music, publishing, and documentary storytelling. For more than 2 decades, Lana has built a loyal following with fearless comedy, sharp observations, and an unfiltered perspective on relationship, motherhood, grief, family, and the messy realities of life. Known for blending stand-up with original music, Lana's 1-hour special, A Song About It, and albums including If These Lips Could Talk, Dick Jokes and Other Assorted Love Songs, and Limeade showcase her ability to find humor in life's most uncomfortable truths. She is also the creator and published author of the 4-book Pounds of Power comic series, and the producer and co-director of Come What May, the documentary chronicling the life, legacy, struggles, and impact of comedian Ralphie May. Whether on stage, on screen, or on the page, Lana Turner tells stories that make people laugh, think, feel, and connect.
Neon Lights Elegy, Cynthia Main, age 26, missing since February 21st, 1986, from San Diego, California. This is my hollowed-out city. The neon trundles of light, comet bright against the seams of my jeans. The wild animal gaze of girls as they startle, quick flash red, as a man slips from an alley, dragging his hand along the wall. There's a cruelty to the morning crush of the bus stop, the shuffle beneath the hesitant sun, the fugitive beat of our hearts, the needle-sharp air in our lungs as we whisper, still here, to every woman we see. But the night still bleeds into the light, the water on our nightstands collecting dust on the still water. Our sweat-soaked sheets with fabric worn so thin we can see the outline of the world through them. I still dream of highway days, the wind whispering through my fingers, but my body knows the language of despair, the ache of walking here again.
For more information about our show, please visit shegoesbyjanepodcast.com.
Bye, Vanessa.
Bye, Amy.